Before we get started, I want to let you know about an amazing holiday promo we're running right now. If you or one of the book lovers on your shopping list would like a membership to the Next Big Idea Club, you can get one right now for 20% off. That's right, 20% off, which means you can get the 8 best books of the year, handpicked by Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, delivered right to your front door, plus access to our app, hundreds of audiobook summaries, and special invites to live events. Check it out at nextbigideaclub.com and use the code podcast20. The curious people in your life will really appreciate it. That's nextbigideaclub.com and use the promo code podcast20. All right, here's today's show.
LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, the physics of life's emergence. This podcast recently turned 5. And in celebrating that milestone, I've been thinking about all the brilliant people we've had on the show, and in particular, all the brilliant scientists. Brilliant, I should say, but also outlandish. I'm thinking about people like Donald Hoffman, a cognitive psychologist who argues that what we perceive as reality isn't actually an objective representation of the world.
Reality is not space and time and its contents. It's something utterly outside of space and time.
Or take acclaimed neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, who blew my mind and maybe yours when she came on the show and said, the lizard brain we all talk about, the one that governs our survival instincts, it doesn't exist.
You can't look at the brain. You can't look at any brain, but you certainly can't look at a human brain and say, well, these parts are for emotion and they're battling these parts for rationality. It just makes no sense from an anatomical standpoint when you look at the structure of the brain.
The point is, we've had some unorthodox thinkers on the show, but I'm not sure any of them are as out there as my guest today, Sara Walker. She's a theoretical physicist based at Arizona State University, and her work is focused on this question: what is life? And while we're at it, how did it first emerge? These turn out to be maddeningly hard questions to answer. Is life defined by its ability to replicate, to metabolize energy? Are viruses alive? Is fire? Many physicists, believe it or not, see this question as unimportant. If you like, you can say that the whole planet is a living organism, or you can say that life is effectively an illusion. It's really a matter of semantics. As Sara was told by her professors when she was getting her PhD, the origin of life is not a conceptually deep scientific problem. To Sara, however, it is the problem, the most interesting question of them all. And she may have found the answer. Sara and her collaborators have come up with something called assembly theory. Though theory makes it sound more tame than it is, they use a laser to blast apart molecules. Then by combing through the fragments, they're able to count the number of steps it took to make that molecule in the first place. And here's where this gets really interesting. When they do this in non-living objects like meteorites, the assembly index, which is the number of steps it takes to assemble the object, never goes above 15. But when they blow up something that is alive, the assembly index is always way higher than that. 15 turns out to be the magic number. It's where the life switch gets flipped on, which means that life is what happens when the universe figures out how to make something complex and replicate it. Life is not the thing. Life is the process. I used the word magic a moment ago. It's an unscientific word, a word we use to describe things we can't understand. For centuries, science has given us great powers, but it has also stripped some of the magic out of reality. In the last century, however, theoretical physics has gotten kind of weird. Einstein taught us that space and time are intertwined and flexible they bend. Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg unraveled the strange and probabilistic world of quantum mechanics, showing that particles exist in clouds of uncertainty, defying deterministic laws. Since then, string theorists have said the universe is comprised of vibrating strings in 11 dimensions. Believers in the many worlds theory suggest every possible outcome of a quantum event results in the creation of a new parallel universe, resulting in infinite universes. The weirdness of science reintroduces some of the magic, arguably, but to what end? For Sara Walker, the quest to understand the story of how we came to be is both fascinating and empowering. She believes not only that we are alive, but that some of us are more alive than others. We have free will, and we have it in proportion to the impact we have on the world, which can indeed be enormous. Understanding our past and imagining our futures is not just a fun exercise, it's a physical act that has the power to expand the possibility space before us and create a better future. A quick heads up, there will be moments in this conversation where you may think, what did she just say? You may find yourself wanting to rewind a section or two, but there is another option. Just let it wash over you. If you understand some of what follows, you'll walk away with an appreciation of our shared reality that's a little bit richer. Sara thinks the fact that we don't understand these things is thrilling. So do I. And maybe you will too, once you hear from Sara Walker.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA, which provides AI solutions that are easy to implement, secure, and tailor to your business. Visit Dell.com to learn more.
I'm Tomer Cohen, LinkedIn's Chief Product Officer. In my new podcast, Building One, I interview some of the best product builders out there. People at the intersection of dreaming and building and learning. Together, you and I will learn from their experiences. If you're just as curious as I am, follow Building One wherever you listen, and check out the conversation on LinkedIn.
Sara Walker, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Sara, you are a physicist, a student of the origins of life, and author of the new book, Life as No One Knows It, The Physics of Life's Emergence. And I'm delighted to be talking with you today for a few reasons. One of them is that I think that origin stories are important, that understanding our collective history makes us feel connected, as we should. And of course, I'm thinking here of the origin story of our species. Mm-hmm. But let's start, if you don't mind, with the origin story of Sara Walker. You went from Cape Cod Community College to a PhD in physics and astronomy at Dartmouth, and now to your role as an influential theoretical physicist, deputy director of the Beyond Center at ASU. Can you tell us a little bit about the journey you've taken to get to this conversation today?
Yeah, it's interesting for me because I think I always heard these stories of my colleagues that knew they wanted to do physics and astrophysics and stuff since they were like a little kid looking up at the stars. And that was not really me. I was always really curious, but I came from a much more artistic family. And so I was always encouraged to be creative.
Interesting.
But I didn't really get too rigorously into academic subjects as a child. And so when I was in high school, I was interested in math and science. And then I didn't have a lot of my family that went to college. So I decided to go to our local community college. And at that point, I thought science was the most interesting thing I was taking at school. And I also really liked math. So I just took a bunch of classes on that. And I took my first physics class that year. And that just totally sold me on physics as being this really amazing introspective into how we humans can come to understand the world around us at the deepest conceptual level. And I just found that incredibly exciting.
I have 3 teenage boys who are have varying levels of interest in math and science, but I think it's kind of wonderful that this can emerge at any time in one's life, or at least in college, and become such a fascinating career. Is that something that you find kind of interesting about your own history?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I think there's a lot of pressure on like people to know what they want to do and find their passion early.
Yeah.
And I think you don't know when you're going to be struck by the thing that you like really are passionate about doing. And so I'm still open-minded that I might change my career choice at some point. It's like you become a professor and it's supposed to be a lifetime commitment. And I just think that's the wrong mentality. I think you should be open
Yes.
to new things all the time. The thing that I've always done is followed my curiosity and the things I was most interested in. So I didn't have a background in science, but I found my science classes to be the most enjoyable. And so I decided just to take more of those because I enjoyed it. But, that could have been something else. It could have been, I also really like art and design. And, I think if I had a second career, I would be a fashion designer, not a theoretical physicist. So I think just being open to what your calling is, so to speak, and where your passion lies is really important. And actually, that's been a guidepost for me throughout my whole career. So the reason I decided to become a physicist was I was deeply passionate about a fundamental understanding of nature. And when I was originally a physics student, I was taught that was particle physics and cosmology and not the problems I work on now, which tend to be much more focused on the nature of life in the universe and the origin of life, and even thinking about, things that come subsequent to that, like intelligence and mind. And those are not usually part of fundamental physics. But for me, what became more interesting was there were fundamental questions to ask there that people weren't asking. And I kept pursuing those opportunities because they were the ones that I found most intellectually stimulating. And so that's how I've ended up where I am, is always just following the passion and the curiosity and where I think things are most exciting. It's worked well for me, but I think it's a great sort of philosophy because I think if you're working on things that you really find exciting, you do your best work. And this is always what I tell my students.
Yeah.
Don't work on a problem you don't care about. Work on a problem you really care about.
Right.
That's when you will do your best work.
And often some of the most interesting problems to be solved are at the intersection of different disciplines, right?
Yes.
Because we know that these different disciplines, the lines between them are kind of arbitrary, and there's often less focus on these sort of liminal spaces between these disciplines.
Right. And you can't be trained for those kind of problems because they're not defined by the boundaries that we put around things. So in some sense, you can't prepare yourself to work on them. You just have to find them and then figure out how to stick all the things in that space. Yeah.
So there's certainly some physics in fashion design. So
yeah,
so we'll watch your career as it unfurls closely. But you've also made a decision to become a communicator of scientific ideas to lay people, to all of us, with this book. And is that something that you think is important? That's not something that everyone in your field chooses to do.
No, and I have a very particular philosophy about that might separate me from other people that are enthusiastic about communicating science, because I don't actually view what I'm doing as telling people, what we think as scientists and what, the current understanding of what's objective is. I'm much more interested in opening a dialogue about what I think are the most pressing questions that we need to ask scientifically right now and getting people excited about the frontier in those questions. So for me, I actually, it's in part a little selfish because I actually think these problems are super important and I want to get people excited about them and I want to see them solved in my lifetime. So I think, changing the culture around how we think about the nature of life and alien life and how we think about solving these problems is actually one of the most critical things we can do to actually make scientific progress. So in some sense, I'm very motivated by the science, the communicating and doing this kind of work. I get really excited about because I think we need to invite as many people into the conversation as possible and actually it's the science doesn't happen in cultural isolation. It is intersecting all kinds of areas of human culture, from the way that we talk about ourselves just in these kind of dialogues to the kind of technology we develop, the kind of art we make. I think if you're working on leading edge scientific ideas, they need to be part of the culture of the time that you live in.
I'd throw something else out, which is that I think that science offers us all an origin story that connects us, which feels to me really important because some other disciplines or areas of thought like religion create narrower tribal affinities. So with that in mind, we have a little bit about the origin story of Sara Walker. How about the origin story of Homo sapiens? How did we get here?
I'm very deeply motivated by this question. And, when you say that, it sounds like human origins, but I think much more existentially about it.
Yeah.
So I actually, for me, the origin of us is a question about how does matter develop things like agency and intellectual curiosity and an ability to actually comprehend the universe, right? So this is a very sort of astrobiological perspective, but it is very curious that we happen to live in a universe that is comprehensible and it has evolved entities like us that are capable of comprehending some of it. And for me, that's sort of the ultimate question. And I take the root of that question to be the origin of life itself, because I think there's some fundamental divide that we have not understood yet about how the universe generates structures like us and what that means much more fundamentally when we're looking out and trying to understand the rest of it. Like we ourselves are actually a critical part of that structure we're trying to understand.
Yeah. But we do know a shockingly large amount about, and it's certainly inadequate, but about like what happened in the seconds following the Big Bang.
Yeah.
And the 14 billion years of evolution, I think something like 4 billion years of the formation of this planet and early life. Could you share with us like a sort of short version of the broad strokes of that story?
Yeah. So early universe cosmology is pretty well worked out. I mean, we have good models of it, although there's a lot of debates in that field still about certain parts of it. But obviously, like, you know, we have the Big Bang cosmology and the formation of matter within the first few minutes after the Big Bang, and then the expansion of the universe and formation of stars and galaxies. And then once you have a couple generations of stars, you have enough heavy elements to make planets, and then planets can do sufficient chemistry, presumably, to evolve living structures, although we've only observed that on one planet so far, which is the one that we happen to be on. So if you think in the grand context of cosmic evolution, there has been this sort of seeming progression of more ordered and complex structures, which is also quite paradoxical if you want to think about the initial conditions of the universe and are they fine-tuned for life and that kind of stuff. But I think what I enjoy about working about on the problem of life itself is I think some of these ways that we've talked about cosmology and being trained as a cosmologist and fundamental physics need to really be inverted to understand what we are and how we came to be from this kind of evolutionary progression of the universe. I guess what I want to say on that is I get very excited about these things, but I think the story is far from finished.
Right, for sure. And I mean, so we know what the Earth is, roughly 4 billion years old.
Yeah,
and
a little older, 4.5.
A little, 4.5. And so 3.8 billion years ago, we think we were seeing the early emergence of life.
At least, yeah. So some current estimates, it's like most of the time it's like the estimate is life emerged between 4.2 and 3.8 billion years ago on Earth. Although the timing is really hard. So there's a lot of debate in the scientific literature about the exact timing.
This first moment of a transition from non-living to living is, you know, people talk about hard problems. Consciousness is usually the word that follows hard problems. There are a number of hard problems, but you might say that one of the hardest problems is how this happened in this moment, right? This kind of miraculous moment of the earliest formation of life. And of course, how and when this happened is partly influenced by how we describe life.
That's right.
So what is it?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I've spent my entire academic career thinking about it. I have lots of thoughts, but I just want to take a step back to your question about framing of origins of life and how we think about it, because I think it's helpful to understand why we might need new ideas in this field based on the way that we've thought about it before. So a lot of the theories of origins of life that have been developed over the last few decades are very biologically motivated by structures that evolved in biology as we know it. So we're very constrained because we only know of one example of life. And so some of that dating of the most ancient life to 3.8 billion years is basically by retracing genomics and trying to infer the properties of what's called the last universal common ancestor of all life on Earth. And so what often happens in the field is we think genetic material is important, something like an RNA molecule replicating in a prebiotic environment. So a lot of focus has been on how do we build a replicating cell with a replicating molecule, actually not even a cell. much simpler in a prebiotic environment? Or how do we get metabolism and energy use to organize some kind of chemical system? So those are the usual ways we think about the first steps of life. I actually think that the origin of life is much more of a planetary scale transition, and it's not happening just in one local environment, but it's actually a global geochemistry organizing eventually into things that we call life that evolve along independent lineages like cells. So that's a totally different conception of the sort of origin story that comes from thinking about geochemistry being the sort of like what eventually emerged into biochemistry. But the question of that you're asking is, what is life and how do we use it to frame the origin? The reason I'm saying about these origin of life hypotheses is like, if you think life is a Darwinian replicator, you're going to look for a replicator. If you think life is about metabolizing food, you're going to look for a metabolic cycle. And so we've had a lot of definitions for life that have informed these sort of partial models of the origin of life that I think are radically incomplete. And so for me, I've been spending most of my time trying to think about like, if you were going to take a whole bunch of physical systems, like things you observe in nature, and try to compress them down to the most abstract and concise description of that broad set of phenomena and have that be deeply explanatory. Like you think about laws of gravitation, they explain everything from, why we're sitting in our chair to why planets are orbiting the sun to the large scale structure of the universe, right? Like there's a huge range of scales and broadness of phenomena. I think the issue with the origin of life is we haven't been thinking about that conceptual level of the problem. And so for me, early in my career, the origin of life became a question of a transition from what we traditionally understand about physics and chemistry to somehow there being this other physics being dominant, this new physics that's about information in some sense, or how does information become a causal category? And I've reframed that many different ways to get to where we are with assembly theory, which I think is a very precise articulation of the conceptual framework. I know we'll get there. But anyway, it's a very long-winded way of saying that I think defining life is very hard. And what I'd like to do is to develop a theory that explains the regularities we associate to life and allows us to quantify the transition at the origin of life. And then I think we will be able to talk precisely about what we think life is. And I have a lot of ideas about what I think life is, but
Yes. And part of what you bring to this conversation and to this exploration is your training as a theoretical physicist opposed to as a biologist, as you said. But you say in the early pages of your book that you were taught to believe as a young physicist in training that life was not a conceptually deep scientific problem. I'm quoting you there. That's surprising. Why would physicists not see life as a conceptually deep scientific problem?
I think a lot of people don't, and it's really mystifying to me. But one sort of easy visual for people is if you go back to the way that we talk about the hierarchy of the sciences, right? So it's really important to remember when you talk about a discipline like biology, chemistry, or physics, those are human-derived categories. And we separate out the world in ways that the world is not separated, right? They're sort of subjective partitions that we use as a manner to study certain areas. And this is why interdisciplinary sciences become so important. But if you look at the sort of standard hierarchy of the sciences, it's like, social sciences are the quote unquote softest science. And then you go to biology, and then you go to chemistry, and then you go to physics, and then you go to math. If a mathematician is not in the room, physicists are like, we're the hardest of the sciences, and, we're at the bottom and we describe reality. So any of the other sort of fields of science are supposed to be derivative of what we understand in physics in some sense. They're believed to be emergent properties of the more fundamental layers of reality, right? So if you accept the sort of standard way of talking about things, it's like there's the standard model of particle physics. It describes all particle interactions. You can derive the properties of atoms from that, and the periodic table of elements basically defines all of chemistry. Chemistry defines all of biology. So there's kind of this implicit assumption that there's no new fundamental rules unless you're looking at the smallest scales. And I think that's inherently incorrect. I don't see any evidence for that in nature. I see that as a mindset that has emerged for very curious social reasons.
Interesting.
And it's not really indicative of what is going on in nature. And there are places in fundamental physics where these problems confront us pretty hard. A really obvious one is when you look at quantum mechanics and you think about the issue of the observer, right? We don't have, quantum theory is not a theory in the sense that general relativity is a theory. General relativity is pretty accepted by the scientific community as like the right explanation. Quantum mechanics is a collection of ideas that have a whole bunch of different interpretations, right? And each interpretation is actually a different theory of quantum mechanics because it has a different explanatory paradigm to explain the sets of experiments and regularities we've observed. They have some common features, but there's no like unified quantum theory, quantum interpretation. And it all comes from the fact that we don't actually know how to account for collapse of the wave function and the way our observers interact with physical reality. And so that should already be a hint that like we're missing some fundamental physics that has to do with entities like us that can design experiments. So I think it's just premature at any point in human history to think that we know everything.
Sure. And so what's the classic definition of life?
Yes.
And how would you diverge from that classic definition?
I felt a little bad because I like totally diverted your question about defining life earlier,
right.
and I was like very political about it. I was like, let me tell you all these other things.
No, we love your digressions.
I can give you a proper properly what I think life is, but so anyway, I'll answer your question more directly this time. So the sort of sets of canonical definitions of life are, like the one you'll see in a biology textbook is life metabolizes, reproduces, is self-contained, has a cellular compartmentalization, like these kind of list description features. And then there's a very popular definition that came out of a NASA workshop that a lot of people in my field use, which is life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Yeah. And it's interesting because if you take a first pass at these things, they seem very descriptive of life. But if you actually dig into the definitions, there's always counterexamples to any definition that you give. And so this is why viruses and fire are always edge cases, right? So if you think about life being something that can replicate, well, viruses can replicate, but they don't seem to have the autonomy of a living cell. And so there's some kind of boundary there that seems like some people feel like needs to be drawn. And then, fire can consume, and like it basically looks like metabolism. If you have a fire rampaging through a forest, it's basically burning off a lot of energy. So these things become a bit paradoxical. And I really think that when we're thinking about the nature of life, the way that we can really think about that formally has to do with how the universe builds complexity and how history and information are necessary for constructing complexity in the universe, which is what we call the process of evolution. And so my definition of life, if I give one, is usually life is how information structures matter across space and time. And that's a very abstract definition, but I think it's actually really constructive. But my point with the sort of not wanting to give a definition is at any given time, I carry probably about 8 working definitions of what I think life is. And they're all conceptually overlapping, but that's healthy for, I think, theory development because you don't want to bias yourself by your preconceptions about the nature of the phenomena you want to study. You actually want to get to the bottom of what the underlying structure is. And you see this throughout the history of science, that a lot of the deep conceptual breakthroughs that we've seen in physics are approaching a phenomena with completely fresh eyes and really trying to understand the structures that's there, not what our cultural biases are about the structure that's there. And this goes back to the question you asked at the beginning about why I do this work. I think unless we change our cultural perceptions of these problems in radical ways, we may not be able to see what's really there. And so I think it's very important to not define things prematurely.
What happens when businesses have Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA? Years of patient data gets distilled in seconds. Investors know the exact moment stock should be traded. And quality checks speed up so production lines never slow down. No matter what business you're in, there is an AI solution that's easy to implement, secure, and tailored to you that can keep your business moving forward. Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA, your way to AI. Visit Dell.com to learn more.
From the minds of visionaries to the desks of disruptors. I'm Lars Schmidt, host of the Redefining Work podcast. Join me each week as we explore the new world of work through the lens of those shaping it. CEOs, HR leaders, investors, and more. Be a part of the conversation that changes everything. Subscribe to Redefining Work today.
You know, one of the things that's fascinated me is, on the one hand, we have, like a child, a toddler, has a natural sense of what is living and what is not living, what's life and what's not life. And then you talk to physicists, and you have some prominent physicists, as you point out in your book, like Sean Carroll, who might say that life is a term we use when we see more complex emergent properties of particle physics. Manifest themselves with a certain degree of complexity. So in essence, it's a kind of illusion. Like it's a term made up by the living to help the living feel special about themselves.
Yeah.
Right? It's all the same thing. But meanwhile, you have others like James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis who might say that the whole planet is a living organism, all of it, right?
Yeah.
And so it's sort of, one can go from nothing is alive to everything is alive, right? So do you feel like you can argue both sides, or you really come at it, I think, from more of a sense of life as an information system?
So I can come at it actually from both sides, and I think that's healthy when you're trying to work on ideas we don't understand, to not adopt a very firm stance too early on. And so, in some sense, I could make the argument that the theories I'm developing say nothing is alive, right? Because it's, in some sense, it doesn't conform to all our prior conceptions of what life is. But ultimately, good theories come from asking good questions. And the question I'm interested in is, how does life emerge from non-life? And you really have to have some kind of working understanding, as you pointed out, of what you mean when you say something is life. Yeah. And so what I find by the exercise of trying to answer the question of the origin of life is that you're trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together and actually make the shape of this thing that happened in the universe. Like, there's ample evidence for life all around us, but we don't actually know how to talk about it in a way that allows us to solve certain problems, which means that we don't formally have that knowledge yet. And so, I actually don't think anyone that's ever talked about this problem is wholly wrong. I think everyone's partially right. But the question is, how do we put all the pieces of the partial correctness together to build the picture so we actually can see it? And that's what I think the real art of theoretical physics is that exercise. And I think that's incredibly challenging because you have to be willing to change your conceptual framing at any moment. But that's actually what I find incredibly exciting about my job. I love doing that. I love changing my mind about things on a regular basis. I think it's incredibly exciting and fun. And I think the fact that we don't understand these things is thrilling about the nature of being alive. It's so exciting, to try to figure these things out.
I mean, one of your comments in the book is that modern science has taught us that life is not a property of matter. Because here I am, touching my arm. I'm pressing against the atoms of which I'm constructed. But you would say that Rufus is not, in fact, those atoms. That I am an information pattern that keeps repatterning itself into Rufus. Right. That it's a system of organization of matter that's self-replicating, that is in fact the life that is me, not what I touch.
Yeah, part of my point with that, and this gets deep into the history of science, and I think what's interesting to me is in a lot of the current narratives that we have about science, we forget, and about objective reality, we forget that these were ideas that people had to develop over centuries, and technology had to be built to take precise measurements, and ideas had to be made that corresponded to measurements. And so part of the argument I make in the book is we do have current theories about what material is, what matter is. But if you think fundamentally about the role of what we call material in theories of physics, we're actually talking about things that are rather abstract that we've embedded in measurement. So a good example is mass or electric charge, right? These were not always concepts that we had as a species. We invented them because we were able to talk about regularity across a broad range of things that we interact with in the physical world where we could reliably measure their properties by using an abstraction called mass to map to those measurements and an abstraction called electric charge to map to those measurements.
Yeah.
And because of that mapping, which is what theoretical physics builds, we call them material. And so when we say the matter we're made of doesn't have life in it, it suggests to me that we're missing a material property. And that material property, I would say, is the causal structure information embedded in time, which is what assembly theory is trying to get at. So I think, this idea that you can reduce you to your atoms and you're just some emergent property, that's sort of, Sean Carroll's view, has completely erased time as actually being a physical property of evolved objects.
Yes.
And this to me is the critical thing that's missing, is that time actually has a physicality to it, and it has a physicality to it in the process of evolution, because evolved objects require time for their construction. They require time to form on a planet. Why are we talking about the origin of life happening 4.2 billion years ago? Because all that evolutionary history is necessary from such event to get to things that can talk about it that way. So I think, I feel very alive. I think it's a very non-trivial feature of being me.
Right.
And it feels very material to me. So I don't know.
Exactly, right. Well, and so getting into assembly theory, which is a new theory that you and some other scientists have developed together. As I understand it, you make the claim that you, as a biological object, contain the full history of the process that was required for you to exist in the universe. Mm-hmm. So you're older than you look, and vaster in time than you appear to be.
Yes. Yeah, and I think it's important to qualify history here, because I think this is another thing that we take for granted. We think the past is behind us, and it's sort of, and we can uniquely construct it. But anything we say about the past, especially 4.2 billion years ago or the Big Bang, is an inference based on the present. And so assembly theory, when we say history and that you are your history, we mean this in a very precise way, that there's a minimal ordering of events that's necessary for something like you to exist. And that structure is the physical thing that we should evaluate when we're talking about things being alive, is this construction history of how many unique steps is necessary to construct an object like this. And it might not be the actual observed history. It might be some things are, take a very long time to form, right? But they could have a very short minimum amount of causation for their ability to form. So I think that's really important distinction to make.
So is there a sense in which you and I are 3.8 billion years old?
Yeah, in clock time, for sure. So this is getting a little bit deeper into philosophy and physics, but I'm very interested in concepts of time and how different concepts of time emerge with different theories of physics. Like every theory of physics has its own concept of time. So we think we understand time, and I think time is a radically complex concept. But we have this concept of linear time that you measure on clocks. And if we date the sort of rock record, and we can date biological evolution by synchronizing clocks and trying to understand them across time, we think life on this planet has been here for 3.8 billion years or so. And so parts of you are that old. And those parts tend to be things like the interior structure of the ribosome, which is important for the translation machinery. It's like a very old molecule. That molecule has a half-life of, I don't know. I actually should look this up. I always want to say this in when I'm talking about it, but I need to find out what the half-life of a ribosome is. But it's probably minutes to days, right? And yet this molecule has persisted on this planet. It's a very complex molecule. Actually, it's a conglomeration of many molecules. It has persisted on this planet for billions of years. So this pattern keeps repeating itself, which goes back to this idea that even you, over your lifetime, your atoms are different than they were when you were born, because you've been eating and reconstituting yourself. But what is persisting in time? It's this constructive process that keeps regenerating you.
And there's something really concretely valuable to measuring the number of steps required to assemble an object,
Mhm.
right? And I think it could be helpful for listeners to understand some of the context of this, right? Was your efforts as both as a theoretical physicist and astrobiologist. I said this to my 13-year-old son, and he said, astrobiologist, but there's no biology on other planets. And I said, well, we'll see. But that it is necessary in order to define what life is, that you all have been able to say that a certain number of steps and certain patterns in the assembly of objects, by which we mean biological organisms, there's a threshold where we know that something is life opposed to not life. And this is something around an assembly index of 15, if I'm getting that right. Maybe I think this piece really puts a finer point on why this is useful as a concept.
Yes. Yeah. So I think what I'll do is I'll try to explain just a little bit of the physics and philosophy and then where this
Great.
idea of a threshold comes from and explain the sort of mechanistic way
Wonderful.
that we get at that. But the sort of framing of the set of ideas that I get really excited about is just to think about all of the things that our universe could generate. And so you like, just even if you sit there and try to imagine it, like you already know it's like a huge space, right? Because we actually are a little stifled even in our ability to imagine it. And the first person that really pointed out to me was Stu Kaufman, like saying, like, imagine all the uses of a screwdriver. And it's like, there's so many, it's almost not countable. And we have the concept of infinity. Like we have ideas about the fact that there are too many things to ever be generated. So in chemistry, actually, this becomes very prevalent as like a physical system, because if you think about all possible molecules you can build from the periodic table of the elements, there are not enough resources in the observable universe to explore all of them, even for small molecule chemistry. So if you wanted to make a molecule in metabolism, even a moderate complexity, and you wanted to make every permutation of such a molecule, it would fill volumes of universes in terms of just having the same molecular formula, but different three-dimensional shapes with the same atoms. So chemical space is very large. And what we see is you get really complex molecules like DNA and proteins that, if you looked at all the ways of configuring those atoms, you would be in an exponentially large number of universes of molecules. Yet we see these things produced on this planet with very high reliability. They're not random. We know they're not random. No. They're products of evolution. That's already, stated. But how do you formalize how not random they are? And how do you formalize that they actually uniquely require a process of evolution and learning to make that specific molecule out of this vast space of all possible structures? And so the conjecture we have in assembly theory about the origin of life is that a planet, is exploring geochemistry, like small molecule chemistry, actually has a sort of boundary, a threshold value of complexity above which you should never expect to see molecules in high abundance unless they're the products of evolution and selection, because the error rate of making all of these other mismatches and other possible molecules is so high, the space is exponentially growing with every bond you make, that it's just exceedingly unlikely to ever see these structures outside of an evolutionary process. So that's kind of a simple statement. What gets interesting about assembly theory is that simple statement becomes one that you can actually precisely mathematically formalize. And you can formalize it in such a way that you can go measure this property of molecules in the lab. And the way that we do that is to talk about the minimum number of steps for building a molecule from atoms, from basic parts, by making bonds. So that's just chemistry, right? You take atoms, you make bonds with them. And so it's easier actually to think about Lego for most people because we don't have visuals of molecules in most of our brains. So I use Lego often as an analogy. But if you think, you had a whole bunch of Lego bricks on the table and you wanted to ask about, how do I make a structure like the Lego Taj Mahal or Lego Hogwarts or pick your favorite Lego set. The way we would talk about it in assembly theory is to take two pieces, put them together, and then take a piece that we've already built and put those together. So you do this as a recursive process of construction. You can only use parts you've already made in the past and build up along the shortest possible route to get to that final structure. And that's what we call the assembly space of the object, is actually all of the steps you had to take on the path to make that object. And so this is what I say when I say it's a minimum history or a minimum amount of causation, is you have to look at the minimum number of recursive operations where you retain memory of the past to build into future objects.
Yes.
And what we conjecture in assembly theory is if that length of path is sufficiently long, above some threshold, you won't observe those objects in high abundance. And we can measure this feature for molecules using a variety of techniques. This is done in Lee Cronin's lab. Lee actually developed the theory originally because he wanted to go in the lab and measure the origin of life happening in a robotic, unconstrained chemical, like a machine that can do unconstrained synthesis at scale. Like, how would you know life popped out of it if it had
the computer?
The computer. Yeah, the computer.
Yeah.
So Lee is a very, very clever human being. He wanted to solve the origin of life by basically treating it as a search problem in chemical space, recognizing how many possible molecules there are, that we need to build robots that can do automated synthesis and actually explore chemical space, much the way that we have search engines on the internet or things like that.
Powered by artificial intelligence.
That's right. Yep. And so we needed to measure. And so he figured out this way of measuring the evolutionary history in molecules in a very objective way, using this assembly theoretic framework. And the idea is, well, the measurements are, you go in the lab and you can infer, you can measure this property of molecules. And what they were able to do was take non-living and living samples and go in to the lab and try to measure the assembly index of the molecules in these samples. And what they found is that living samples were the only ones that produce molecules above 15 steps, which is where this number of 15 comes from.
Yes.
Like, that's an empirical observation derived from this theoretical conjecture that there should be such a threshold, and it was validated experimentally. And, part of our thinking on it is there really is a real physical complexity threshold above which living systems are the only ones that exist above that level in assembly space. And this becomes the definition of life in some sense, is the physics that crosses that boundary and can carve trajectories into more and more assembled objects that are deeper and deeper in time, more and more construction history for their formation. And so that's how we conceptualize life in assembly theory and how we measure it.
Do we humans have the highest assembly index of any objects in the universe? We haven't
measured it for humans. It's actually very So where we've been able to measure it so far is for molecules. I think we've made major advances in getting to being able to have it a measurable property of minerals. Minerals have really different properties than aqueous molecular chemistry because they're rigid structures and they have periodic lattices. And so Lee's lab has been working on assembly theory applied to minerals quite extensively. And we're trying to build a general theory of assembly theory that will allow us to apply it to different kinds of substrates. Like if you wanted to study morphological forms and say, when were they, when does evolution actually take hold and you see the shape and it's not a shape that could form randomly, or or language as a living system, right? Like I'm really interested in applying the theory to artificial intelligence algorithms and trying to determine at what point do you say that these systems are autonomous in the sense that they're constructive processes in the universe.
Right.
But we're a little ways off from that. So I wouldn't say humans are the highest assembly index structure because I don't know how to think about the structure of us as an assembly space yet and what the right measurement would be that and the way that we think about that. But I think it certainly is the case that the theory would point to the fact that structures like us are very deep in time and very, require a long history for our formation. And I think some of the things I think about with the nature of like how our cognition works and how our consciousness works, I would point to me that we probably are the highest assembly structures just because of the kind of level of abstraction that humans can do that we don't see in other objects in our biosphere.
And when an object like you or me is deeper in time and has a greater complexity of our assembly, does it also follow that we tend to have a broader possibility space in front of us? Is there a symmetry to complexity in the past and possibility space in the future?
Yes, that's right.
So that's exciting.
Yeah, so that's actually what I was like. The part of this idea that I was saying that the future is larger than the past is assembly space is a combinatorial space. So this is one of the reasons I was saying it's hard to map assembly and the concept of time and assembly to clock time, right? Because clocks are linear. They tick, they tick, they tick, they tick. And in assembly theory, you're constantly combining structure, and there's ordering to that structure, but it's not an absolute ordering. There's some relative ordering in the sequence of things. Like you could stick these two Lego together or these two Lego together first, and it would be kind of arbitrary to the overall causal structure that builds your Lego castle. So the temporal sequence is a little bit different than what we talk about in assembly theory. And my reason for stating this is it's a combinatorial kind of time. And what happens there is the deeper you get into the assembly space, the more combinations you have in the past that you can use to construct the future. So the future horizon is larger for more complex objects. And there's more memory to construct that future horizon. And so this is very consistent with what we see right now in sort of the modern space of technologies and technological growth. We are constantly recombining different technologies to build new technologies. And it's just very apparent.
Yes, right. And evolution has done this in building us.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
That's right. Yeah.
And I love your comment that the more things that can be constructed by a given object, the more alive it is.
Yes.
So this is interesting. You see degrees of aliveness.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me intellectually because I obviously started trying to do the divide between non-life and life, right? Like this is the question I'm interested in. Like, how does life arise from non-life? Yeah. But by the process of doing that, you end up with a kind of concept of life that is so deep in general that you can no longer look at it as a binary categorization of nature. It is on this kind of scale where you can now quantify, how alive things are by how constructive they are, or whether something is the product of life because it can only be generated by a living thing. So that was kind of an interesting intellectual inversion.
Right.
Going back to the idea of like constantly having to change your concepts. So I do think that the transition in the origin of life is rather abrupt. I think there's a very abrupt transition that happens at some threshold, and it might be 15. But it might not be. Like we have work yet to do there. But I think it's a very, very abrupt transition between non-life and life. But I think this idea that you can qualify and quantify life as kind of a broader spectrum is very relevant.
We operate within the constraints of physics. You say, however, that the laws of physics are actually just descriptions that will eventually be replaced with more precise ones. But you say something kind of counterintuitive, which I find pretty interesting, which is that in order for the structure of life to emerge, it needed to emerge on a scale in which there was greater determinism, if I'm saying that correctly, right? That there were constraints were necessary for life to evolve. And, this gets into the question of whether, to what degree we live in a deterministic universe. But determinism is to some degree our friend, right? Because it provides constraints that made it possible to evolve complex forms. And I would also add it's what makes it possible for us to reliably fly 80-ton chunks of metal we call airplanes through the air at 500 miles an hour and reliably land them, which I still find astonishing.
Yeah, every time I'm in an airplane, I think about that every single time. And I fly a lot, so
right, that's a lot of thinking, yeah.
But it is shocking that they work so well, and also that we built them.
It really is. I always think for anyone who's skeptical about science that you're expressing your faith in the scientific method every time you get in an airplane.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And if a non-scientist offers you a ride in their airplane, I would not get into it. It's just like, yeah.
Oh, that's very funny. Yeah, I think that the determinism discussion is kind of interesting because, the traditional narrative in physics is the universe is deterministic and clockwork. That goes all the way back to Newton, right? And so everything's kind of determined by the initial condition and the laws of physics, which kind of exist outside the universe. So this is the idea, like where the idea that the universe is fully deterministic comes from as a concept in modern science is really the Newtonian perception of nature, which has carried through with all physical theories. And also this is one of the reasons that interpretations of quantum mechanics are hard, because the deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics is many worlds. Yeah. But it's hard to have evidence of these other worlds, right? Unless you want to take, in some sense, a philosophical leap and assume that to be the most explanatory theory, which, some people do. And I think those kind of arguments make sense, but it's not, for me, it's not the best explanation.
Yeah.
So the sort of conception that I have and we have, and Lee and I are talking about this quite a lot lately, and working on some things related to it is, the underlying physics of assembly theory is really the physics of selection. Like just thinking that selection is a fundamental mechanism. Like not everything that we can imagine to exist can exist or will ever exist. And the universe is actually constructing itself. And as the universe moves forward in time, selection has to happen in order to decide what things exist. And the reason that time becomes important and there's persistence between moments in time is because selection is extended across time in these construction histories. And so I would say, you gave the example of an airplane, but even us as individuals with, lifetimes, 70 to 100 years if we're lucky, as human beings are deterministic, right? Like I'm a deterministic structure that keeps persisting in time. Yeah. And I think this is the kind of determinism that's actually really necessary to understand in life. It's actually an emergent determinism. In some sense, my conception of nature right now is that the underlying reality is non-deterministic outside of selection, and selection via interaction of objects sets regularities and constraints. And those constraints themselves might become universal laws, like they apply to every object in the universe, or they might become local laws, and they just allow regularity called Sara Walker to persist for however long I'm going to live, right? So the determinism emerges along these lineages of constraints. And lineages are also a really important concept for us thinking about the nature of life is this lineage of causation, and that these lineages are living structures. And so I have some conception that life is almost, in some sense, one of the most deterministic features of the universe. But anyway, anything built by selection becomes a deterministic feature. And we move into this very highly complex space where there's so much possible things that could exist that don't. And every single thing you do is, drawn out of an exponential space of possibilities. The fact that the universe can do anything, like any decision can be made, is like a remarkable feature of reality and not a trivial one. And it doesn't trace you could not put enough information in the initial conditions of the universe to explain it all. Like it would have to be infinite density. It's just silly.
So it's ironic that you would say that life is the most deterministic part of the universe when you also defend the possibility of free will, which I appreciate, and so an opportunity for autonomous volition, in theory, emerges in the context of the most deterministic corner of the universe, right?
Right.
Is it interesting?
So if you
imagine, there's an interesting tension there.
Yeah, it is an interesting tension, but I think it's actually what makes free will possible, right? So the traditional debate around free will is the underlying laws of physics are deterministic, therefore there's no possibility for it. So you really, and that to me is a really interesting intellectual leap that a lot of people have chosen to take, because the laws of physics as we understand them now have nothing to do with life, like nothing, except for the fact that intelligent living things built experiments to confirm these mathematical relationships, describe things outside of them. Like that's the only relationship those laws have to living things. And then yet we use that as an inference to say reality is fully deterministic and there's no possibility of free will. And so that to me is missing a lot. And one of the things that I can just point to most simply is it's missing the concept of time being important in building structures like us and this sort of like combinatorial structure, which allows, there to be the future is not fully determined by the past because the future has more possibilities than the past. And so you don't have enough information in the past evolution of the universe to actually specify everything that happens in the future. If you think that the laws of physics cannot exist outside of the universe and they're actually embedded in the structure, the physical thing that exists inside the universe itself, there's not enough information if the universe is getting bigger. And in fact, we know cosmologically the universe is getting bigger. So this is not even just an argument about biology. It's just a fundamental fact of our universe that it's getting larger in lots of ways. It's getting larger in terms of combinatorial possibilities in biosphere. It's getting larger in terms of the coordinate space, the coordinate geometry of the large-scale structure of the universe. And you have to ask, where is the information coming from to specify how the universe is updating those gaps? All
right. You and I are in some sense 3.8 billion years old. That's how long it took the universe to construct us. The more steps that are required to build an object, the deeper it is in time and the broader its future possibility space. Living organisms like us are deterministic structures that keep persisting in time, lineages of causation that Sara sees as one of the most deterministic features of the universe. And yet, the future is undetermined. It's bigger than the past, and you and I can help create that future. Some of us more than others, apparently. The more things that can be constructed by a given object, Sara tells us, the more alive it is. That's a lot to digest. Sara and I will be back on Thursday for the second half of this conversation. We will talk about consciousness as a collective property, and we'll get into free will. We talk about the search for aliens and the possibility that they might live among us undetected in a shadow biosphere. We discuss why the invention of new technologies of perception tends to precede the discovery of new forms of life, and why our first alien contact may be with an alien that we create. We talk about AI as a planetary scale intelligence, and the possibility that we may be like the DNA for AI, a life form on which a larger scale form of life depends. We talk about the physicality of imagination and the force that optimism exerts on the future. And finally, we discuss how Sara's understanding of physics changes the way that she approaches her life. Can't wait until Thursday? I don't blame you. If you want to hear the rest of our conversation now, there's an easy way to do that. Download our app. You just search for Next Big Idea in your app store, and you'll find the whole conversation there. You will also find that warm, fuzzy feeling that comes from supporting the passionate team at the Next Big Idea Club. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound designed by Mike Toda. The team at the LinkedIn Podcast Network has an assembly index that is off the charts. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you on Thursday.